Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 618, Live by the Sword. On the subject of legendary figures in Japanese history and the way they get transformed from actual people into legends, there's one more person we absolutely have to talk about, more so than even Yoshitsune. He's well known in both Japan and in the wider world, and his legend has only grown in stature, though, practically speaking, we know almost nothing about him. His name is Miyamoto Musashi, and like Yoshitsune, the stories that had grown up around Musashi are so well known, so firmly established, that today it's an incredible challenge to separate fact from fiction. Unlike Yoshitsune, though, with Musashi there's one person above all others who probably deserves credit for creating his legend. His name is Yoshikawa Eiji, and he's not the sort of writer you'd probably encounter in a literature class focused on Japan. He's not, in that sense, as famous as someone like Natsume Soseki, who we talked about a few weeks ago, or as internationally regarded as writers like Oe Kenzaburo or Kawabata Yasunari. Yet within Japan, I would bet more people have actually read his work or seen one of the many works adapted from it. Yoshikawa, alongside his later contemporary Shiba Ryotaro, is one of the two most famous authors of historical fiction in modern Japan. And as an aside, of course, there's a whole other conversation we could have here about who gets considered literary, whose work is considered pedestrian and beneath serious analysis or being included in fancy literature courses. There's a big component of elitism and classism that I would argue goes into those distinctions. That's a conversation for another time. Anyway, Yoshikawa Eiji was born in 1892 to a former samurai family of what was then called Odawara Domain. Now it's the western and southern parts of Kanagawa Prefecture, just south of Tokyo. The Yoshikawa family had once held honor and distinction as samurai themselves, but by the 1890s, their old social class no longer existed, and Yoshikawa Eiji, as a young boy, had to make a living, as most people did in Kanagawa in 1890, as a dock worker in the growing complex of docks around modern Yokohama. The family situation was dire enough that he eventually ended up having to leave school at 11 to work full-time to help sustain the family. But when he was 18, a serious fall at work almost killed him and forced him to look at other avenues for work. He moved first to Tokyo, working in a lacquerware shop, and it was there he took up writing as a side interest. In 1914, at the age of 22, he won a writing contest sponsored by the major publisher Kodansha, and in 1923, when Tokyo almost burned to the ground in the Great Kanto earthquake, the aftermath sparked a sort of resolve in him to do what he actually wanted to do with his one wild and crazy life, and write full-time. In 1926, he had his first bestseller, Naruto Hicho, or The Secret Scrolls of Naruto, and from there his career trajectory was pretty much meteoric. Other than a brief stint as a war correspondent in China in the late 1930s and a period after World War II where he briefly stopped writing, it's not entirely clear why, he would remain active in the publishing world until his death in 1962, and he was prolific. When Kodansha published a complete edition of all his works in 1975, the whole thing spanned 161 volumes. By a good number of metrics, 60 years after his death, Yoshikawa Eiji is still the best-selling novelist in Japanese history. But the most famous of all of those works is almost certainly Musashi, which Yoshikawa actually began to put together, in a certain sense, almost as a bet. In 1933, two of Yoshikawa's friends and fellow writers, Kikuchi Kan and Naoki Sanjugo, were engaged in a good old-fashioned historical beef, as one has, over the question of Miyamoto Musashi and his legend. You see, the sources that we do have from closer to Musashi's own life described him as a titanic swordsman, nigh invincible. Musashi's own magnum opus, the Gorin no Sho, or Book of Five Rings, saw him describe himself as such, quote, "Facing off in numerous life-and-death matches, I never once failed to seize victory. Afterwards, I trekked through the provinces to challenge swordsmen of various systems and remained undefeated in over 60 contests." Yet Naoki Sanjugo did not buy the hype. He thought Musashi's legend was overinflated. He pointed out that there are differing accounts of the major events of Musashi's life, we'll get to those in a second, and that some are more impressive than others, and in addition, that the recorded partners of Musashi's duels, the people who are named, were not that famous or well-known themselves, so Musashi essentially beat up a bunch of nobodies to earn his reputation. Kikuchi Kan, meanwhile, defended Musashi's historical reputation as well-deserved. Yoshikawa was present for the discussions, and eventually, of course, was asked to weigh in. He didn't, at least right away. But 2 years later, he began to publish Musashi, a serial novel released in the pages of the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. It took him until 1939 to finish the story, but overnight it became a sensation. It sold like hotcakes, or I guess kake udon in its day, and eventually would have a series of spin-off adaptations from the 3 samurai movies starring Mifune Toshiro as Musashi to the modern manga Vagabond, based primarily on Yoshikawa's version of the Musashi story. Alongside his novel Taiko, which is his version of the life of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and his version of Heike Monogatari rendered in more modern Japanese, Musashi is, again, probably one of his most famous published works, arguably the most famous, and given, again, he wrote 161 volumes of material, that's quite a long list. Now, Yoshikawa Eiji did his homework. When he wrote historical fiction, he was, as I think most good historical fiction writers are, serious about his research. But he was also a novelist looking primarily to make a compelling story about a man whose strength of will allows him to ascend to the pinnacle of his craft and become the greatest swordsman of his generation, arguably all time. In other words, first and foremost, he was looking to create an interesting story with a workable narrative arc. And that meant he invented a good number of details. Major figures in his version of Musashi, for example, the childhood friend Honiden Matahachi, or the love interest Otsu, are entirely invented for the purposes of Yoshikawa's narrative. Matahachi is supposed to be this basis of comparison with Musashi. He also aspires to greatness but lacks the drive for it. Otsu represents the chance for a more normal, traditional, loving life that Musashi rejects in favor of the pursuit of greatness. It's all very compelling, and it's a great read, but today is not about the novel, as famous and wonderful as it is. It's a far more straightforward question. What do we actually know about Miyamoto Musashi, and where did the legend that Yoshikawa Eiji built on even come from? So first things first, if you've never heard the name Miyamoto Musashi, who the hell was this guy? Well, frankly, that's kind of a hard question to answer. We don't know that much about Musashi with genuine certainty. Basically everything we know about him can be traced to one of 3 sources. First, there's the Book of Five Rings, written shortly before his death in 1645, and then 2 more sources from about a century later. The first is Bushu Denraiki, roughly a chronicle of Musashi Province, written by one Tachibana Minahide in 1727, a samurai retainer of the Kuroda clan, a family whose history is very interwoven with Musashi's military career. The second is the Bukolden, written in 1755 by Toyoda Masanaga, a retainer of the Kyushu-based Hosokawa clan, who hosted Musashi during the final years of his life. These texts, unfortunately, differ in some pretty important ways, which we'll get to in a second, and quite possibly invent some of the finer details of Musashi's life that they include. Unfortunately, alongside the Book of Five Rings, they're basically the only sources we have for his actual life. All our later ones are based on one of these 2, and since Musashi himself was pretty sparing with the biographical details, we don't have a lot to go on in general. So big picture, what do our sources agree on? Well, for a start, that Musashi was born in Harima Province, what's now a part of Hyogo Prefecture just west of modern Osaka. They also agree that he was descended from a pretty important samurai family, the Akamatsu, about whom we've talked in the past. The Akamatsu were major players under the rule of the Ashikaga family, who claimed the position of shogun back in the 1330s but lost control of Japan in the 1460s at the start of the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Civil War. The Akamatsu specifically were one of the major families of Shugo daimyo, territorial lords who governed the provinces on behalf of the shogun. But they'd had a particularly spectacular fall from grace in the 1440s. The reigning shogun of the time, Ashikaga Yoshinori, had a reputation for violent capriciousness, turning on anyone he suspected of treachery or disloyalty, which is all well and good, except that it tends to mean anyone who suspects their head might be next on the chopping block has a big incentive to act first, and so when the head of the Akamatsu clan, Akamatsu Mitsusuke, got wind that Yoshinori had plans to replace him with another relative Yoshinori trusted more, possibly because that relative was also Yoshinori's lover, it was a whole thing, Mitsusuke decided to act. In 1441, he invited the shogun to a feast at the Akamatsu mansion in Kyoto to celebrate the defeat of another rebelling vassal family, and at this feast, Akamatsu Mitsusuke assassinated the shogun. Mitsusuke probably hoped the act would demonstrate how far he would go to protect what he saw as his. Instead, it just gave other Ashikaga vassals an excuse to gang up and take him down to avenge the shogun. The Akamatsu family were largely wiped out by other powerful vassals fighting for a chance to pick over the scraps of their holdings, and in the aftermath the family lost basically all of their land, which did include Harima province, which they had once governed. But Akamatsu descendants remained in a lot of places the family had once ruled, and all our sources agree that on his mother's side, Miyamoto Musashi was descended from the Akamatsu. It's quite possible his father was as well, but the ancestry on that side is more complicated in ways we don't really have space to get into. Suffice it to say, a couple of adoptions make things tricky. Our sources also agree that Musashi's father was a skilled martial artist with a particular focus on the jitte. This is a type of blunt, one-handed metal weapon with a hook towards the hilt used to catch swords and disarm opponents. His father's name is also given a few different ways in the texts. It's Shinmen Muninosuke Nobutsuna in Bukoden, and Miyamoto Munisai in the Bushu Denraiki. In and of itself, that's not that troubling. Names, as we've seen many times in pre-modern Japanese history, were pretty fungible commodities up until the mid-1800s, and you'd go by a few different monikers based on the context. That name, Miyamoto, for example, is taken from the family's home in the village of the same name, a small town along the Sanyodo Road that connects the western part of the main island of Honshu with Kyoto. Shinmen, meanwhile, is a name taken from a samurai family that Musashi's father had served. It was not uncommon as a reward for lower-ranking warriors to be allowed to use the surname of their masters, a mark of favored treatment. Probably Musashi's father actually went by Hirata Munisai, but in any sort of official documentation, he might have used the Shinmen surname to take advantage of the luster that it lent him. Both texts also agree that Musashi's father, who I'm just going to call Munisai, was a master of something that became a hallmark for Musashi later in his career, fighting with two swords at once. This approach, which is still legal, for example in kendo, modern Japanese fencing, does of course have some nifty advantages. You can use one sword to defend and foul up an opponent's guard, and press the advantage on the attack with the other. It's also not something most people train against that much. Your average opponent doesn't really know how it works and might not know how to respond. But it also has some big disadvantages. Most notably, a one-handed strike will always be weaker than a two-handed one, and thus easier to block or deflect. You need a really clear opening to be able to get a strong attack in. Swords are also, and these are the keen insights I know you come to this channel for, very heavy, and that means it's very easy to tire yourself out during a fight since you are literally swinging twice as much weight as your opponent is. Fortunately for young Musashi, all our sources also agree he was physically quite strong, and thus capable of managing the task. Bukoden doesn't give us much on his early life though, except that as a young man, he excelled in both his father's jitte and two-sword techniques. Bushu Denraiki offers us a bit more, describing the young Musashi as such, quote, "From an early age, he scorned his father's art of fencing and regularly criticized his father. Though Musashi was Munisai's only son, it was probably because of Musashi's lack of respect that the latter harbored a grudge against him. One day, Munisai was carving a toothpick with his knife. Musashi was sitting on the ground some 2 yards removed from his father. Suddenly, Munisai took the knife and threw it at his son. Musashi dodged the knife by turning his head away, causing it to pierce the pillar against which he had been leaning. Greatly angered, his father said, 'Lately you have studied my art of fencing, and I intended to cut the tip of your right earlobe to remind you of this fact, but you turned your face away and sought to evade the danger. You are a thorough disgrace. Having said this, he evicted his son from his home. At the time, Musashi was 9 years of age. After that, Musashi went to Harima, where his uncle from his mother's side resided. His uncle had taken up the tonsure, become a Buddhist monk, and was living peacefully in a small retreat. It was there Musashi grew up. Now, beyond the, let's call it dubious parenting, there's a lot to unpack here. First, this little anecdote is the source of something that would become a stock part of the Musashi legend later, that as a boy, he was a bit of a wild child. It does seem like if there's any basis to that story, it would indicate a pretty bad relationship between father and son, but it only appears here. It does also tell us one other interesting detail here. Note the bit, Musashi went to Harima, but Harima's where he's from. How could he go there? Well, that's because a reader of the Bushu Denraiki would be expected to know that Musashi's father was a vassal of the Shinmen family, who were vassals of the Kuroda family. And in the 1590s, the Kuroda relocated down to Kyushu from Harima to support Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea. By the way, this also sets up something of a pattern where Bushu Denraiki, even though it leaves things out, will generally give more details about Musashi's early life than Bukoden will. To give another example, Bukoden deals with Musashi's very first recorded duel, also mentioned by Musashi himself in the Book of Five Rings as such. Quote, in the first year of Keicho, that's 1596, when he reached the age of 13, he had a duel with the Shinto-ryu adept Arima Kihei and defeated him. So it's one sentence. By comparison, Bushu Denraiki has a whole elaborate story. Musashi sees Arima Kihei put up a sign asking for challengers, writes a response letter challenging Arima, gets yelled at by his uncle for daring to challenge a grown-up when he is just 13, his uncle tries to step in and call off the duel, and then, quote, Musashi just ignores his uncle's attempts to make peace, rushes at Kihei and tries to jump him, and then, quote, both were too close to inflict any wounds on the other, and they remained locked in an embrace, their hands above each other's shoulders. Musashi now suddenly dropped his sword, ducked to the floor, put his shoulders under his opponent, and toppled him headfirst to the floor. Then he took up his wooden sword again and killed Kihei with a succession of 14 or 15 blows. An age seemed to pass before the spell that descended over those who had gathered had finally lifted. So yeah, just casually beating an adult to death as one does. Obviously, one account is a little more detailed than the other, and the Bushu Denraiki one in particular raises some interesting questions that remain a topic of conversation among historians. In particular, Arima Kihei is described as a practitioner of Shinto-ryu swordsmanship, which is from eastern Japan, what's now the Tokyo area. But neither source says that he's from that area, and Bushu Denraiki describes him wearing something called a karusan hakama, which is based on the trousers worn by the Portuguese and common in Kyushu. The question of Arima Kihei's background remains kind of contentious, especially because the answers might give us some insights into the regional connections between different parts of Japan and different schools of swordsmanship. Speaking of unanswered questions, now we arrive at one of the most interesting ones, Musashi's role in the Battle of Sekigahara. So this, as a reminder, is the climactic showdown in 1600 between the 7-year-old boy Toyotomi Hideyori and his followers, his father having died a year and a half prior, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had launched a war to remove bad influences from Hideyori's inner circle, basically as an excuse to seize power for himself. If you just pop onto Google and see what you get, you'll probably be told that Musashi did in fact fight at Sekigahara, the climactic battle that saw Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces from eastern Japan defeat the western coalition of pro-Toyotomi lords. Your sources will probably also tell you that Musashi fought on the western side, in other words, the losing anti-Tokugawa side. But that story has a lot more to do with the popularity, frankly, of Yoshikawa Eiji's book, which starts with Musashi in the aftermath of Sekigahara, as the experience of defeat galvanizes him in his journey to become the ultimate swordsman and find genuine meaning in the pursuit of greatness. Again, great story. The sources don't back it up. Bukoden doesn't actually mention anything. It just says that the battles that brought Tokugawa Ieyasu to power in 1600 happened, and closes with a brief mention of the suicide of Akamatsu Hirohide at the end of the year, who had turned against Ieyasu and been ordered to kill himself because of it. That's only mentioned because that's the end of the main Akamatsu lineage from which Musashi was descended, so it was considered worthy of inclusion. But Bukoden doesn't say anything about Musashi fighting for the western side, or indeed at all in this war. Bushu Denraiki does, and rather explicitly, but the version it gives is totally different from the conventional story you'll probably find online. You see, according to Bushu Denraiki, Musashi fought in the campaigns that brought Tokugawa Ieyasu to power, but not at Sekigahara. He rejoined with his father Munisai, with whom he had somehow reconciled despite all that knife-throwing, and returned to Kyushu, taking up the cause of Kuroda Yoshitaka, who was their feudal lord. Kuroda Yoshitaka, though, was not on the western anti-Tokugawa side. He was on the eastern side, the pro-Tokugawa one. Musashi was not on the losing side. He was on the winning one. Musashi, by the way, doesn't mention anything about his military career in any of his work, except once briefly in a letter he wrote towards the end of his life to one of the officials of the Hosokawa clan who hosted him late in his career. Quote, "From a young age, I have in all gone into battle some 6 times, 4 times out of which I was in the absolute vanguard. This is widely known, and of course, there is also proof of it. However, it is not at all with a view to advance my social position that I mention this." So it's widely known, which is why he provides no proof, and therefore we have none today, to the eternal frustration of all historians. We don't know which battles, but certainly there's not really as much reason to doubt the Bushu Denraiki description of which side Musashi was on in the Sekigahara campaign than there is to doubt Yoshikawa Eiji's made-up story about him actually being at Sekigahara. So one of the most famous stories about Musashi is just a fabrication. And here we enter yet more narrative confusion, because after this point, both Bushu Denraiki and Bukoden recount Musashi's epic duels during which he established his reputation, but in very different ways. There's probably no better example than the 2 most famous incidents of Musashi's life. If you've heard anything about him, it's probably one of these 2 stories. The first is his feud with the members of the Yoshioka School of Swordsmanship, based in Kyoto and long considered one of the most prestigious swordsmanship academies in Japan, largely because once upon a time, its masters had been responsible for teaching swordsmanship to the Ashikaga shoguns themselves. Both Bukoden and Bushu Denraiki describe Musashi challenging the members of this school in 1604 when he was 21 years old. According to Bukoden, it was simply to prove that he could. Bushu Denraiki, as is its wont, has a more complicated explanation. Musashi simply didn't think he could get a travel permit to move between provinces and challenge different schools to matches, without proving that he deserved to be taken seriously as a samurai with some actual reputation. Broadly, the 2 texts agree on the sequence of Musashi's fight with the Yoshioka school. First, Musashi takes on Yoshioka Seijiro, heir to the school leadership. Both Bushu Denraiki and Bukoden describe Musashi flooring Seijiro with just a single blow, beating him so badly Seijiro needed medical intervention, and eventually just had the fight beaten out of him altogether, and became a Buddhist monk. I do have to say that Bushu Denraiki describes a bit of skullduggery on Musashi's part to pull this out, though. Quote, "When the day came, Musashi excused himself as he was ill in bed. Seijiro now sent round messengers several times strongly urging Musashi to fight, and thus Musashi mounted a palanquin and arrived at the appointed place wrapped in a futon. Seijiro went up to the palanquin and peered into its compartment, inquiring, 'How is your illness?' At this, Musashi thrust open the door of the palanquin, leaped out, and floored Seijiro in one blow with his makurobokto, his padded sword, so that the latter passed out." Interesting that Yoshikawa Eiji didn't choose to make famous the image of Musashi as guy who jumps people who were just coming to check on his health. Though, to be fair, Bukoden also describes Seijiro and the other Yoshioka school students who eventually fight Musashi using shinken, real live swords, where Musashi at this point only has a bokto, a training one made of wood, so maybe the cheating cuts both ways. Both Bukoden and Bushu Denraiki then describe Seijiro's brother, Yoshioka Denshichiro, coming after Musashi, and once again, he is felled in a single strike. This time it's more than an injury. Musashi kills Denshichiro in one blow. But here, once again, the narratives diverge pretty radically. Big picture, they largely agree on what comes next. Musashi takes on the last of the Yoshioka family, Mata Shichiro, the son of the same Seijiro who just got whooped so badly he decided to become a Buddhist monk. Both sources also agree that Yoshioka Mata Shichiro led a group of followers to ambush Musashi at a place called Kudarimatsu, these days traditionally identified with Ichijoji Sagarimatsu, a temple just 2.5 kilometers or 1.6 miles north of Ginkakuji. It's in the eastern part of Kyoto. But the details of what comes next are very different, even if they end in the same place. Bukoden, as laconic as ever, describes the clash as such, quote, "But Musashi saw through the ambush, he killed Mata Shichiro and dispersed his followers, and having displayed his supremacy he returned to Kyoto. As a result, the House of Yoshioka ceased to exist." Bushu Denraiki, of course, tells a more complicated and very different version. For starters, in this one, Musashi is not alone. By this point already, he has a dozen deshi, or disciples. Though none of them are named, they do join him in the initial fray. In Bukoden 2, Musashi does briefly have disciples mentioned, but none of them join him in the fight. He tells them to leave him because, quote, "to go in with a large number of followers and join battle is tantamount to forming a faction and raising an army. The shogunate has issued a decree forbidding such things. I must observe these injunctions. I would feel guilty if any of you were to join me." The Bushu Denraiki version of Musashi does not have this hesitance, but he does eventually send his followers back when one of them is injured in the fighting. Instead, he goes solo, as he takes on, quote, 30 men, then 50, 70, 80 to 100, who attacked him from all directions, but he drove them all back. Ultimately, though, he can't beat them all, and he's forced to hide in a temple until the Kyoto Shoshidai, the Tokugawa shogunate official who kept the peace in the city, arrived to deal with the situation. A far less glorious outcome, though it does accord a bit more closely with one of our other sources, a funeral monument to Musashi's legacy erected by his adopted son, Miyamoto Yori, in Kokura after Musashi's death. The monument does describe some of Musashi's famous battles, and describes Musashi fighting the Yoshioka with his disciples at his side, though in this one Musashi doesn't retreat into Ichijoji Sagarimatsu. Instead, he frightens the Yoshioka into a retreat with a forward charge that scatters them all. Now, today the image people have of Musashi's fight with the Yoshioka is usually a mix of the two, but it leans towards the less detailed Bukoden version. Most Musashi tales, including Yoshikawa Eiji's, describe Musashi taking on the Yoshioka single-handed, probably because his disciples being around makes the whole thing look less courageous. Bushu Denraiki also adds an extra element to the story that nobody else mentions, and so far as I know was not picked up by anyone else. It claims that the last Ashikaga shogun, Yoshiaki, who was deposed in the 1570s, had decades previously summoned Miyamoto Musashi to Kyoto to duel the then head of the Yoshioka school, Naokata, the father of the boys Musashi just defeated. Back in the day, the matches went 2-1 in favor of Miyamoto Musashi. Now Miyamoto Musashi had wrecked them all. That story is almost certainly an invention. It appears almost nowhere else, and of course the symmetry of it all just reads more like a script than anything else. I mean, come on. That might also be why Yoshikawa Eiji gave less credence to the Bushu Denraiki version of Musashi's life, which also flips the script on one of the most famous moments of Musashi's career, his duel with Sasaki Kojiro. Now, this is probably one of the most heavily mythologized parts of Musashi's whole life, both because every source we have mentions it, and because Musashi doesn't talk about it once. Even the name of his opponent, Sasaki Kojiro, is part of the legend. No source uses it before the late 1700s, and possibly it was made up by kabuki writers looking to flesh out Musashi's backstory for their various plays in his life. Bushu Denraiki gives his name as Tsuda Kojiro. Bukoden confusingly calls him Ganryu Kojiro, and I say confusing because Ganryu is also the name of the school of swordsmanship that he's supposed to have practiced, and the name of the island where the fight took place. Now, two things made this duel particularly famous. The first is the duel itself, which takes place on Ganryu Island off Kokura in northern Kyushu. The date's not clear. Bushu Denraiki actually puts this in 1602, which is before Musashi's fight with the Yoshioka school, Bukoden puts it afterwards, though the date is left ambiguous. Both largely agree on how things came to be, that Kojiro was a well-known swordsman who defeated several other opponents. He was then challenged by Musashi. They also agree the duel was approved by the local lord. Dueling was a legal thing between samurai, and it was regulated, you needed permission, but disagreed on who was sent to observe the outcome. Most crucially, the two sources disagree on how Musashi won. The Bukoden version is way more famous. This is the version where Musashi deliberately shows up late to the duel with a boat oar instead of a sword. His goal was to provoke Kojiro into a rage by disrespecting him, and, so to speak, throw him off his game. This is what happens. Musashi beats him to death with the boat oar. It's a whole thing. In Bushu Denraiki, though, it's the other way around. Musashi's on time, Kojiro is late, and then comically falls on his butt while getting out of the boat that takes him to the island. To be honest, the whole thing comes up as goofy. He then gets into a yelling match with one of the officials who's supposed to observe him, and then dies almost instantly in the duel. I can see why the Bukoden version is much more famous. It comes off as dramatic instead of vaguely comical. Even here, our sources are pretty different from the later legends. In later Musashi stories, especially though not only Yoshikawa Eiji's telling, the duel with Sasaki is basically the culmination of Musashi's career, his defeat of a man who is almost his peer that proves he really is the best of the best. But in Bukoden and Bushu Denraiki, the fight comes pretty early in his life. Musashi continues to duel for almost 10 years after this point, though no duel gets quite as much detail. It's only in the funeral monument erected by Miyamoto Yori that the duel with Sasaki Kojiro, or whatever his name was, is listed last, and even then there's no date given, nor is this implied as any sort of culminating moment. The creation of the Musashi-Sasaki rivalry was, in other words, basically a myth stirred up after the fact. Now, I could go on in this vein for a while about differing stories told across these texts, but I think it gives you an idea of how divergent our sources on Musashi can be. The narratives don't fully come back together until Musashi's retirement to Kumamoto and eventual death as a monastic in the Reigando, a cave and pilgrimage site just outside Kumamoto City, with the end of his life coming in 1645. It's at that cave in the final months of his life that, according to tradition, Musashi dictated the Book of Five Rings as a testament to his students. It's from these sources, Bushu Denraiki, Bukoden, and to a lesser extent the monument of Miyamoto Yori, that our knowledge of Musashi as a historical figure emerges. His memory, though, is something different. It was kept alive in Kumamoto by the students of the school of swordsmanship he helped found, the Niten Ichiryu, and was eventually discovered by kabuki playwriters in their constant search for fresh material to transform for the stage. You start seeing the first Musashi plays in the 1700s. Presumably, one writer or another came across a copy of Bukoden or Bushu Denraiki and found them interesting reads. Later on, plays like Katakiuchi ni to Eiyuki, or Chronicle of the Avenging Two-Sword Hero, written in 1835, helped take Musashi's legend to national prominence. That tale in particular is about the Ganryu Island duel and helped make that incident famous nationally. Now that meant that there was not one Musashi legend by the end of the feudal period in Japan, but several, competing narratives which authors could borrow from or use as needed, and which Yoshikawa Eiji, when he wrote his novel, could use as the basis for the story he wanted to tell about how drive and determination can overcome any obstacle. Given Yoshikawa Eiji's own life, a child of impoverished samurai heritage who overcame his family's handicaps and a horrible injury to become internationally famous, you might see why that sort of story would appeal to Yoshikawa Eiji, why he would read what was available about Musashi and interpret it into that sort of tale. And that's what I think is interesting about Miyamoto Musashi. To be entirely frank, and with apologies to Yoshikawa Eiji, I don't think the question he started with, was Musashi the greatest swordsman in Japanese history, is frankly really that interesting, more than anything because it is unanswerable if you don't have a time machine. Far more interesting to me is why, out of all the potential famous samurai in Japanese history, Musashi was the one available to Yoshikawa, so to speak, to tell the story he wanted to tell. That question, I think, tells us a lot more. about what made Musashi's story interesting to people in the Edo period, chroniclers like the writers of Bukoden and Bushuden Raiki, who wanted to preserve the story of Musashi as it related to their local history, then to the authors of kabuki plays looking for fresh grist for the drama mill, and then to authors like Yoshikawa Eiji, who tied all these different strands together into a single narrative. If you want to understand why did Musashi become a legend, I think this is why. It's important to remember that legends don't exist in their own time. We make them because we need them. We repeat them because they speak to something that we need in us. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Special thanks to new patron William for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week when we tentatively have an interview planned that I think you all will find quite interesting.